Well, hey everybody, I'm going to do a quick video just kind of walking through some of the forms of regression that we've used. And I'm going to use some data from my dissertation actually. And so it'll be kind of fun to see. I've deleted a lot of the code and the content that I used in my dissertation because I think it was a little complicated. But I do want to show you just a few tricks that I use that hopefully will be helpful. And then we're going to walk through some different types of count regression. We're going to talk about Poisson, we're going to talk about negative binomial, and we're going to talk about Logit in this video really quickly. So again, I want to just kind of walk through a few thoughts about the do file. So what you see here is I'm using the codes that we've already talked about, clearing all, capturing log closed, but I want to point out this new one. It's called set more off. The idea here is sometimes when you're using Stata, if you run a long code, it'll say basically more, and you have to like keep hitting enter to get it go down. But if you hit set more off, it automatically does it. Now, in the most recent version of Stata, I don't think that's a code you necessarily have to have, but it is helpful if you find that it keeps saying, oh, there's more, and I have to keep scrolling or clicking to go through it. This will just kind of put it there. Um, that being said, just to point out that I had to update my globals based on my current directory and where the information was. So I added that in here as well. And then I call the data, just like we said, and I identify the log that I will be using. And so we're going to add 2025 to this so we don't mess it up, which I think I already have, but that's okay. Um, and, and then the other thing I wanted to point out is, we talk about this global up here that puts this text in. You can also create a global that will add number of variables that you want to put in. So the reason this might be helpful is let's say that you're doing a study where you're going to, include institutional size and this is one way to do it is you can create a global for institutional size and then you'll just use this to put it there. So you put the code or the different variables. So we have a dummy for between 0 and 1,000, between 5,000 and 10,000, and then you'll notice the one that I've left out, that will become the reference category. So I've left out between 1001 and 999. That becomes the reference category because that's the one that I've left out. So if you're ever trying to predetermine the reference category, this is a great way to do that, is by having that institutional size global and then choosing all the dummy variables that I've created. So this is any institution that falls between 0 and 1,000, any institution that falls between 5,000 and 10,000, basically. And I've created it so it's 1 if they fall into this, 0 if they don't. 1 if they fall into this, 0 if they don't. This just makes it so it's easier for me to kind of identify that reference category if I need to do that. If not, I can also just put institutional size, which I believe is the variable, and I put I and then dot and then institutional size. And so that is another way to go about doing this. But this is the way that I did it in this particular process. So I also just want to call out that just as you're figuring out, there's a lot of different ways to do these analyses. So don't stress out too much. This first one is just a basic regression. And so I will run this code so you can kind of see what it would look like. You'll notice it takes a little bit of time because this is a lot of variables. And so what we're trying to understand here is the number of years that a president will serve. So this is tenure in years. And what we find is that age is negatively correlated with the number of years I serve, which makes sense, right? The older I become a president, my age at appointment, the less number of years I'm likely to stay because I'm more likely to retire or to leave. We also see that if I was an internal hire, there's no statistical significance. When we look at kind of these size categories, we don't see any real significance here. But fit was my focus here, and I had created some indices to determine fit. And so I was excited because high fit means I'm more likely to stay, right? And so again, this just kind of shows us from a regression standpoint. Now, here's the problem. Tenure in years is not actually continuous, right? Because chances are I'm not going to be in a president forever. So it's not 0 to 1,000,000. It's probably more like 0 to, 20, right? That might be the longest a president might serve, maybe a little bit longer in some cases. So regression in this case is not appropriate, right? And so that's one of the ways to think about this is this the right method? And so regression, we know it is not appropriate. And so then we can look here at some of the M logit, which is a multinomial logit. And so let me go and we'll run this. And this is where we get into things where logit typically is a dichotomous variable. So you're either male or you're female, or whatever it may have you. But in this case, we are going to go ahead and I'm going to run these mlogits for you to think a little bit about. So hold on just one second. So when we look at the mlogit, what I've done is I've divided the group into three categories: short tenure, average tenure, which I believe in this case was between 4 to 6, and long tenure, which is more than 6. So short tenure is lower than 6, long tenure is a lot more than 6. And what we find is in the multinomial logit, if I am going to be in the short tenure becomes the group we're comparing to. So compared to the short tenure group, my age still is associated with average tenure, right? It's still a positive, and this is called a relative risk ratio, but it's basically the probability that I'm going to be in this group. So it's still positive. Or actually, in this case, it's negative, because in relative risk ratios, anything under 1 is negative, anything above 1 is positive. So think about it this way. If I were to say that you are 0.9 times as likely to eat ice cream tonight, that means you're less likely, because 1 times likely is you're likely, but 1.9 times likely is you're more likely to eat ice cream tonight. So we see that in this case, like, age is still significant. We also see that physical sciences, you are significantly more likely to be in the average tenure group if you have physical sciences compared to the short tenure. We'll look here to see if you are studied in the physical sciences. You're less likely, but it's not statistically significant. So that's interesting. Physical sciences is only for that average tenure group. So again, multinomial logit means that I can create multiple categories. Now, in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to try just a regular logit. So the code for that is logit. And so we're going to see what is associated with being an internal hire. And so I can't use IRR, I have to use OR. And I'm going to get rid of my little here thing so we can go to logit. And there we go. So when we look at this logit, what we're seeing is that the association between being an internal hire, age, it has increased your odds of age. Minority, these are not significant. But if my prior job was out of higher ed, that's 0, obviously, which makes sense. We're less likely because, again, if you're an internal hire, chances are your prior job is not outside of higher ed. And so anyway, this is the logit version of this, which again is either I was an internal hire or I wasn't an internal hire. So now I'm going to take you to another space, because here's the other thing. Even though tenure is not continuous, which is why we can't use a regression, we actually can't use this logit or non-logit, because that might be a little bit weird as well. And so we need to find a model that accounts for count. And so a count model is something that says, yes, it's going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 10, 20, 30, 40, or 50. So there's a limited number, and it's going to be distributed between this limited number. And so that's what tenure is. It's limited. And so in this case, we call it a Poisson regression. And so the Poisson regression accounts for that weird distribution, right? And it just gives us better estimates. So these kind of relative risk ratios, they're better estimates when we account for this. And so now we see, oh, internal hire is actually statistically significant. I am more likely to have a longer tenure if I am an internal hire, right? And so my coefficient is 1. So for being an internal hire, it increases my tenure by 1 year almost. Same if my prior job was a president, it increases my tenure by at least a year. So that's Poisson. Well, here's the thing. Poisson is one way to do this, but let me give us another one. There are a lot of count model regressions, and Poisson works for most of them. But what if I have a negatively skewed data set? So in this case, tenure is actually less than 5. That majority of cases are less than 5. And so in that case, I want to change my distribution again, and I use what's called the negative binomial regression model. And so in this case, what we'll do here, and we'll get rid of, we'll just run this whole code. So we'll run this negative binomial code. And what we're going to see using the negative binomial regression model is that this is going to account for the fact that it's much more likely to be less, right? And so it just changes the distribution and gives me more accurate estimates. It's still the same interpretation. It's still the same. in a lot of ways, but it just changes the distribution and it accounts for that. One other thing I want you to notice is with a negative binomial, with Logit, it's going to run the regression model multiple times and it's going to try and find the best iteration. And that's what we're seeing here is the best iteration, which is another reason using statistical software can be so helpful. So I know we'll talk more about these. I just wanted to give you a couple of examples to walk through how to think about some of these ideas and how to think about different models. Again, when we think about regression, it doesn't work well if it's not really a true continuous variable. Logit is great for dichotomous outcomes, yes or no, male or female, internal, not internal. Multinomial logit, that's when we have multiple groups, but there's only 2 or 3 groups. So M logit is for short tenure, average tenure, long tenure. And then if we have a count variable that is continuous, but it is skewed in a specific direction, Poisson is great for count data where it's 1 to 10 or 1 to 20. And negative binomial is really good if it's negatively skewed, so towards the bottom. So again, just accounting for the different variations of data. Hopefully that's helpful. I look forward to visiting with you about this as we continue through the course.